Kylian Mbappé didn't play in El Clasico. He wasn't even in the stadium. But with one tap on his phone, he inflicted more damage on Real Madrid's dressing room than Barcelona did in 90 minutes. The Santiago Bernabéu is a stadium built on the mythology of nights exactly like this one, where legends are forged in the fires of impossible comebacks and defining victories against their eternal rivals. Yet, as the clock ticked down in this definitive clash, the atmosphere wasn't one of defiant belief, but of a suffocating, almost paralyzing despair. Real Madrid were trailing 2-0 to Barcelona. Down on the touchline, the cameras repeatedly cut to Álvaro Arbeloa, a manager who looked less like a tactical mastermind, trying to solve a puzzle, and more like a man watching an empire crumble in real time. Across the pitch, Hansi Flick's Barcelona were not just winning a football match, they were officially clinching the La Liga title, doing so on the very turf of the defending champions. It was a comprehensive tactical dismantling, a humiliation that confirmed a second consecutive trophyless season for the so-called New Galacticos era. The narrative was supposed to be about the football. It was supposed to be about how Flick had exposed Arbeloa's defensive setup, and how Madrid's grand project had spectacularly backfired. But that is not the real story. The media is talking about the 2-0 defeat. The fans are talking about Hansi Flick's tactical masterclass. But the real story isn't what happened on the pitch. It's what happened in a living room miles away. As the second Barcelona goal hit the back of the net, sealing the fate of the match and the domestic season, millions of phones vibrated with a social media notification. Kylian Mbappé, sidelined with a hamstring injury sustained in late April, had posted a story on Instagram. It was a seemingly innocuous image, a shot of his television screen, showing the match broadcasting the very moment his team was being mathematically eliminated from the title race. He was watching from home. He was engaged. He was, ostensibly, supporting his teammates from afar, while recovering from his physical ailments. Nobody is talking about the exact timeline of this post. To the untrained eye, or perhaps the overly generous observer, it was merely an injured superstar showing solidarity. But within the hyper-scrutinized, fiercely political ecosystem of Real Madrid, where every gesture, every silence, and every social media update is dissected by an aggressive press and an unforgiving fan base, this was a nuclear detonation. When Kylian Mbappé arrived in the summer of 2024, it was heralded as the final piece of an invincible puzzle. He was supposed to be the crown jewel that would establish a dynasty lasting a decade. Instead, what followed was a grueling 24 months of tactical confusion, internal finger-pointing, and a profound identity crisis. 2 consecutive seasons without a major trophy is not just a disappointment at Real Madrid, it is an institutional earthquake. And in the epicenter of these relentless tremors stood the French forward. The local press, always needing a villain to sell papers when the team falters, quickly zeroed in on him. He was no longer the savior. He was the disruption. He was the reason the midfield lacked cohesion. The reason the defensive line was exposed. The reason the sacred dressing room harmony had evaporated. The scapegoating was methodical, persistent, and overwhelmingly loud. The generous reading is that Mbappé, injured and isolated, simply wanted to show he was tuning in. The less generous reading, and the one that terrifies the Madrid board, is that the dressing room has already splintered beyond repair. Think about the implications of the timing. You do not post an update of yourself comfortably watching television at the exact moment your colleagues are suffering their most humiliating defeat of the season. You do it before kickoff. You do it after the final whistle, with a message of resilience. By hitting publish exactly when the 0-2 reality set in. Mbappé was doing more than watching a game. He was holding up a mirror. The fans in the stadium were booing. The internet was exploding with outrage. They accused him of mocking the crest, of deliberately trolling his own team while they bled on the pitch. They saw a disconnected mercenary rubbing salt in the wound of a dying season. But to understand why Kylian Mbappé posted that photo at that exact second, we have to stop looking at him as a football player and start looking at him as a politician fighting a war for his own legacy. To understand the gravity of that single Instagram story, you have to rewind the tape and examine the psychological warfare of the past 2 seasons. When Kylian Mbappé was unveiled at the Santiago Bernabéu, the stadium echoed with the promise of an untouchable European dynasty. The board had assembled a roster of terrifying potential, but almost immediately, The reality on the pitch refused to align with the fantasy on paper. The midfield looked congested. The defensive transitions were chaotic. Matches that should have been routine victories turned into grueling, disjointed struggles. And when a billion-dollar machine stutters, the ecosystem inevitably demands an explanation. When a system fails, it is always easier to blame the most expensive, most visible variable rather than questioning the underlying architecture. Mbappé became the perfect alibi. Pundits dissected his body language, pausing frames to highlight his moments of walking while the team was out of possession. The local press crafted a relentless, suffocating narrative. His presence unbalanced the squad. His ego stifled his teammates, and his reluctance to track back was the singular reason Álvaro Arbeloa's tactical blueprint could not function. The manager's inability to control the midfield was conveniently masked by the overwhelming noise surrounding the French forward. For 24 months, Mbappé absorbed the brunt of the institutional anxiety. He was the lightning rod for every dropped point and every tactical failure. Then came El Clásico, the ultimate litmus test. Because of a hamstring injury, the lightning rod was removed. This was supposed to be the moment Arbeloa's pure, uncompromised vision finally took flight. Without the alleged disruption of their superstar, Real Madrid were supposed to operate as a cohesive, balanced unit against Hansi Flick's Barcelona. Instead, what unfolded was a systematic slaughter. The defensive block was dismantled. The midfield was entirely overrun. The severe structural flaws that had been explicitly blamed on Mbappé for 2 years were suddenly laid bare for the entire world to see, completely independent of his existence on the pitch. As the second goal crossed the line, sealing the fate of the match, the internet erupted. Furious Madridistas and prominent local publications immediately weaponized his social media activity. Leading fan channels with millions of subscribers captured the vitriolic sentiment perfectly, declaring, "He is mocking us," posting from his couch while the badge is dragged through the mud. It is a total lack of respect for the project. The media immediately tried to frame him as a detached, arrogant mercenary laughing at his own club's demise. That is not a player clumsily navigating social media. That is a calculated political statement. Mbappé is acutely aware of the narratives surrounding him. He knows that every frame of his public life is fiercely analyzed by an unforgiving press. Posting a picture of that exact moment, at that exact scoreline, was a deliberate act of highlighting a glaring, undeniable truth. It was a silent counter-argument to every critic who had spent the last 2 years questioning his tactical discipline and dedication. He was essentially forcing the board, the media, and the fans to look closely at the television screen. The manager was completely out of ideas. The players were wildly out of position. The system was fundamentally broken. And he wasn't even there to break it. Let us look at the anatomy of a social media post in modern football. When an injured superstar wants to show solidarity with his struggling teammates, there is a universally accepted, highly sanitized PR playbook. You post a picture of the television screen right before kickoff, perhaps accompanied by a few encouraging emojis or a club hashtag. Alternatively, if the team suffers a heavy defeat, you wait until the dust settles, posting a carefully crafted graphic the next morning about standing together in tough times. What you absolutely do not do, under any circumstances, is post an image of the broadcast at the exact second your fiercest rivals are putting the final, humiliating nail in your team's coffin. Nobody is talking about the timestamp of that Instagram story. It was uploaded just moments after Barcelona went 2-0 up. It was published right as the Santiago Bernabéu fell into a stunned, venomous silence. At that specific moment, the broadcast directors were frantically searching the stadium for reactions, zooming in on the devastated faces of the Madrid hierarchy in the VIP box, and lingering on the paralyzed, defeated figure of Álvaro Arbeloa on the touchline. The narrative of the entire season was collapsing in real time. And right then, amid the absolute peak of the crisis, Kylian Mbappé decided to remind the world exactly where he was. He was at home. He was completely detached from the wreckage. To understand the sheer weight of this twist, we must look at what his absence was supposed to mean for this specific match. For months, prominent pundits and influential voices within the Spanish capital had argued that Arbeloa's complex tactical system was being inherently compromised by Mbappé's positional freedom. The argument was simple, almost intoxicating for a fanbase desperately looking for a quick fix. Remove the demanding superstar, restore the rigid structure, and the team will finally click into place. El Clasico was billed as the ultimate proof of concept. This was Arbeloa's grand opportunity to vindicate his philosophy, to demonstrate that the collective was being suffocated by the individual. Instead, the collective utterly disintegrated. Without Mbappé on the pitch to attract double teams, the attacking wings were entirely sterile. Without the constant threat of his transitional pace, Barcelona's defensive line pushed ruthlessly higher, suffocating the midfield and exposing a Real Madrid defensive setup that looked shockingly amateurish. The 2-0 deficit was not just a loss on the scoreboard, it was an ideological bankruptcy for the coaching staff. And that brings us back to the photograph. By publishing it at the absolute lowest point of the match, Mbappé brilliantly flipped the entire narrative. He didn't need to arrange a controversial, tell-all interview with a French newspaper. He didn't need his representatives to quietly leak whispers of discontent to international journalists. He achieved a complete public relations victory through absolute, calculated silence and a single, well-timed image. The psychological implication sent across the internet was brutally clear. You said I was the problem. You said my presence was fracturing the dressing room. You said my style of play was destroying the manager's defensive shape. Look at your team now. That is not a display of poor judgment from a disconnected athlete. That is a devastatingly effective counterattack against an institution that spent 2 years trying to make him the scapegoat. It was a silent revelation that the rot runs much deeper than one player's defensive work rate. Mbappé's empty seat at the Bernabeu proved, once and for all, that the true crisis at Real Madrid wears a suit, stands helplessly on the touchline, and is named Álvaro Arbeloa. There is a completely valid version of this story where Kylian Mbappé, recovering from a frustrating hamstring injury, simply wanted to project unity. The generous reading is that he was genuinely watching his teammates, felt the agony of the 2-0 deficit, and clumsily attempted to show he was suffering alongside them from his living room. In this version, the timing was just an unfortunate coincidence, a catastrophic PR misstep from an athlete who is usually heavily guarded about his public image. But we are talking about Kylian Mbappé, a player who has spent his entire elite career controlling his narrative with ruthless precision. He does not make PR mistakes of this magnitude. To believe this was an accident is to fundamentally misunderstand how modern superstars operate. The less generous reading, and the one that is currently sending shockwaves through the highest levels of the Real Madrid hierarchy, is that the dressing room has already splintered beyond repair, and the manager has lost complete control of his most valuable asset. Consider the power dynamics at play. Real Madrid is an institution that prides itself on absolute authority. The crest is heavier than any individual name on the back of the shirt. Yet, here is a situation where a player feels the active need to weaponize his own social media, following to protect his personal legacy from the tactical failures of his head coach. He bypassed the club's carefully curated press department. He ignored the standard protocol of post-match solidarity. He spoke directly to his millions of followers across the globe, offering a silent, undeniable piece of visual evidence. This disaster is not my fault. When a superstar believes he must protect his own reputation from the club he plays for, the relationship is fundamentally broken. That is not a minor dressing room disagreement. That is an institutional civil war. Álvaro Arbeloa has spent the entire season subtly allowing the media to blame Mbappé for the team's lack of balance. Mbappé, in turn, waited for the perfect, most excruciating moment to expose the manager's tactical bankruptcy. It is a terrifying realization for the board. They did not just buy a generational talent. They bought an independent corporation that refuses to be dragged down by a failing system. The silence from the club in the aftermath of the post speaks volumes. There were no immediate statements defending the player, nor were there any public reprimands. They are paralyzed, because punishing him validates his point, and ignoring it allows his silent rebellion to become the defining narrative of a trophyless season. This was never just about a 2-0 defeat to Barcelona. It was about who gets to write the history of this failure. And with one photograph, Mbappé made sure that history will not blame him. The dust from El Clasico will eventually settle, and Barcelona will lift the La Liga trophy under the steady guidance of Hansi Flick. But the 2-0 defeat at the Santiago Bernabeu is not the conclusion of this narrative. It is merely the prologue to a brutal, unforgiving summer. Real Madrid is an institution that does not tolerate failure, and it most certainly does not tolerate public displays of internal division. A ruthless purge is inevitable. The question that will define the next chapter of European football is no longer whether sweeping changes will be made, but rather who will survive this high-stakes game of political chess. Will the board side with their billion-dollar investment, thereby admitting that Álvaro Arbeloa's managerial appointment was a catastrophic error? Or will they attempt to discipline Kylian Mbappé, risking the complete, irreversible meltdown of their most ambitious sporting project in modern history? Mbappé has drawn his line in the sand. For 2 years, he silently absorbed the blame for a tactical structure he did not design and a chaotic midfield he could not control. His physical absence during El Clasico was deafening, but his single image broadcasted from his living room was a roar. He has essentially dared the Madrid hierarchy to make a definitive choice between a failing, rigid system and a generational talent who flatly refuses to be sacrificed to protect a manager's fragile reputation. The locker room is inevitably split. The media battle lines are firmly drawn, and the current silence from the executive box is deafening. Tell me in the comments what you actually think. Is Kylian Mbappé being unfairly used as a scapegoat for a structurally broken Real Madrid? Or is his undeniable ego and political maneuvering the real reason this grand project is fundamentally failing? Come back to this video when the summer transfer window officially opens, because this silent war is just beginning, and the impending fallout will inevitably reshape the entire landscape of the sport. If this kind of analysis is what you come here for, hit subscribe. We don't just watch the matches, we decode the politics behind them.